Hello, these are flipped notes 7-6 on psychoanalytic theories of personality. My Bitmoji is a baby because she has regressed as a defense mechanism. So we'll talk about that in this section. So the psychoanalytic theories should sound familiar because those are all related to our boy Sigmund Freud. We know that he helped people with nervous disorders, and he called that hysteria, which today would probably be kind of referred to as anxiety and depression. But his main goal was to try to help people figure out what was in their unconscious mind. And from that work, developed our first comprehensive personality theory. He was exploring the unconscious, which we know is a reservoir of mostly unacceptable thoughts, wishes, feelings, and memories. Remember, there's no true way to analyze the unconscious, which is why his theories are considered invalid today because they lack empirical evidence. But Freud did want to ask his patients to say whatever came to their mind, which was free association, in order to try to figure out what was there in the unconscious. And he hoped that as they were speaking freely, they would start to reveal some of these unconscious, unacceptable feelings, urges, sexual thoughts. That process of free association, of looking at those chain of thoughts, was known as psychoanalysis. But it often led to painful and embarrassing unconscious memories. But Freud said that once those memories were retrieved and released, that was part of the treatment, and the patient would feel better. Freud identified three main parts of the mind, and we've talked about this before. He compared the mind to an iceberg, with the largest and most important part being the part of the iceberg below the surface, the unconscious, which is hidden from our awareness. He also recognized the preconscious area, which included information that's not really in our conscious mind, but if we needed to, we could recall it. So those are memories, things from our past that we're actually able to recall. And the part that is on the surface, what we can see are our conscious thoughts, and that's what we are currently aware of. But Freud was most interested in those unconscious influences, and he said they would show up in different places, including the latent content of dreams. Remember, that was the symbolic meaning of dream images. That showed up from what's in your unconscious mind, and through other things like Freudian slips, when we made those slips of the tongue where we would accidentally say something incorrect, but Freud believed those were our true unconscious thoughts coming to the surface. Maybe you recall our video clip from earlier in the year, from the wedding in the episode of Friends where Ross says, "I take the Rachel," instead of Emily, even though Emily's the one he is getting married to. So Freud's theory of personality includes three main parts of the mind. The first part is the id. A lot of times these are compared to having the little devil and the little angel on your shoulder and then having your own mind in between, and that's a pretty good comparison. The id represents our unconscious, and it's striving to satisfy our most basic and aggressive needs. It operates on the pleasure principle, which means it wants to be satisfied immediately, immediate gratification. The other end of the spectrum is the superego, and it provides our standards for judgment. It's basically our conscience, what helps us to determine what's morally right or wrong. And then in the middle is our ego, which is conscious. The other two are unconscious. And the ego is what's trying to mediate and compromise between the superego and the id, and it's acting on the reality principle. A little bit more about each of those. Again, the id is acting on instincts, the ego on reality, and the superego working with morality. So the id is inborn. That's what we're born with as babies. That's all we have is an id, according to Freud. It's unconscious. It's where our instincts reside. Eros and Thanatos are there. That's promoting self-preservation. It does relate to drives that reduce hunger, thirst, and sex. And the death instinct, Thanatos, is there as well. The id is the first to form, so it operates on that pleasure principle. When you think about babies, they just demand immediate satisfaction. They cry, pick me up now, feed me now, change me now, pay attention to me now. They want that immediate satisfaction with little regard to what anybody else thinks. The id, especially as it grows older, can become aggressive, but the id is also playful and represents the child in all of us. So early on, the id definitely dominates the personality, as demonstrated here in this diagram, but that can't last forever. As we grow older, the other parts of our ego or our personality need to develop further. We learn from our parents about beginning to consider the needs of others. So the diagram shows that an id that is disproportionately large compared to the ego and the superego is normal during the early years, but somebody who's like that as an adult may be considered irresponsible or just not grown up. The formation of the superego is the next component to form, and it is like your conscience. The parents play a major role in the development of the superego by what they're teaching you of right and wrong as a child, but we also pick up on those things in our environment from schools, churches, anywhere else we're learning right and wrong. Gaining experience with rules and values. The superego is not always conscious, so sometimes we don't realize what we're doing. Too much superego can be a bad thing because then you're too inflexible, you're not willing to bend the rules, you can start to become too judgmental. So the superego can be just as relentless and unreasonable as the id in its demands. Some people have considered when they look at what would happen if we didn't have a super ego. And we look at case studies of serial killers like Ted Bundy, and we'll talk about him a little bit more in class. But some people would argue, of the psychoanalytic perspective, that serial killers have no super ego to tell them right from wrong. The third element of the personality that Freud identified is the ego. The ego is logical, it's the decision maker, operates on the reality principle, and it's the only part of the personality that is conscious. And its job is to mediate and compromise between the id and the superego, which is not always easy. So there's 4 ways that we can deal with conflict. We can attack, we can fight back, we can flee. Sorry, there's little sound effects on there. We can take flight, we can compromise, or when we can't deal with any of those, we can resort to defense mechanisms. So Sigmund Freud originally identified all these defense mechanisms, and there's actually quite a few more than what we'll talk about here, but these are the most famous ones, and the other ones are pretty self-explanatory. But it was also Sigmund Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, who continued to explain and define those. So some people suggest that she was really just piggybacking off of her dad's reputation, but others argue that she was her own original thinker. So, what are defense mechanisms? Defense mechanisms are ways that we unconsciously distort reality when we can't cope with what's going on in order to spare us from anxiety and stress. So, it's a way that the ego unconsciously protects itself from conflict between the id and the superego. You'll recognize a lot of these in things that we do normally, and they're really only unhealthy when they start to cause self-defeating behaviors and emotional problems. The first of the defense mechanisms is rationalization. This is when we attempt to justify our feelings, behaviors, and motives, which would otherwise be unjustifiable. Maybe your team lost, and instead of recognizing that your team wasn't prepared, maybe you rationalize your loss saying, well, that team shouldn't have been in our district anyway. People who stealing is wrong, but they may steal from the rich or from the government and say it's okay because they're giving it to the poor, or it's okay because they're such a big group. Or kind of on the silly end here, Girl Scout cookie season. I always tell myself it's okay. It's a fundraiser for those kids so I can eat all those cookies, even if it's not so healthy. Projection is when we're, excuse me, unconsciously rejecting emotionally unacceptable things about ourselves and then projecting those things onto others. A common reason for prejudice is we have bias in ourselves and then we reflect that as bias towards others. When we say something is stupid, maybe we're actually saying we're stupid. And another example here, jealousy. You want to break up with your boyfriend or girlfriend, but you accuse him or her of wanting to break up with you. So what you were accusing of somebody else are really your own feelings that you are projecting onto them. Displacement is our next one. With displacement, we have an emotion that we can't take out on its original source because that would be unacceptable, like yelling at your boss, yelling at your teacher. So instead, you take out or you transfer that emotion to a more accessible substitute. So you're mad at your parents, but instead of yelling back at your parents, you take it out on your little brother, punching the wall or some kind of inanimate object. In the cartoon down here, he's upset with his boss and he goes home and yells at his kid instead. So you are displacing your emotion to another more accessible source. Fantasy is our next one, an imagined sequence of events or mental images used to gratify unconscious wishes. So when you can't live out the reality, then you live it through fantasy. It's an excursion from reality. This could be as simple as just spending a lot of time daydreaming. But technology has enabled this as well, where people may create sort of alter egos or do some kind of role playing simulation kind of games online where they can live out some sort of fantasy life. Sublimation is our next one, and this one's actually one that's not so bad. In this one, we have instinctual drives that are consciously unacceptable, so we divert them into more socially acceptable channels. That you're mad, so you take that anger, that stress, or that frustration, and you sublimate it, or you channel it into something good, like you go running. A lot of artists will channel their tension or unhappiness with the world, especially things like poverty and race and just whatever else they're not happy about, and they channel it into their art. Sometimes when people are stressed, they power clean their house. So they're just putting it somewhere else. Another example might be if you're playing in a game and the ref makes a bad call, and you channel that energy into doing the next play, playing super hard, running really fast, doing whatever you can. You sublimate or you channel that energy into something more acceptable. Repression is our next one. And repression is when we banish unacceptable thoughts into our unconscious mind. And we do this unconsciously. Repression is really kind of underlying all the other defense mechanisms because we're pushing thoughts away and we're replacing them with some other kind of behavior. For example, maybe somebody witnesses a murder, but they don't remember the details when asked by the police. There was no actual physical trauma, but it's sort of a type of amnesia. Sometimes those repressed thoughts may show up in dreams and Freudian slips. Other people claim that they may have them come back later, but there's a lot of controversy about the recovery of repressed memories, which we talked about in our memory unit. Dissociative amnesia is a form of repression, and we'll talk about that in our disorders unit as well. Reaction formation is our next one. This is when we adopt attitudes or behaviors that are the opposite of what we're actually feeling, because unconsciously that's unacceptable. So maybe you're claiming to hate somebody and they're your nemesis, but unconsciously, maybe you're in love with them. Maybe you really dislike your math teacher, but you tell everyone how much you do like them. Or maybe you don't like them unconsciously, but you bring them gifts. So reaction formation, you can't accept the opposite feeling, or you can't accept your true feeling, so you show the opposite feeling. Denial is pretty much what it sounds like. The defense mechanism used when you're confronted with an intolerable reality, so you refuse to accept those painful truths. Maybe you get rejected from the college of your choice, but you're in denial, and you continue to tell everyone that you're going there. Maybe you've learned of some kind of painful information. Somebody learns about a cancer diagnosis, and they continue to be in denial that that information is true. We also know that to be one of the first stages of grief. Regression is our next one. Regression is when instead of coping with a behavior, we revert to a childlike behavior. So the common example of this is an adult or somebody who's old enough to handle their behavior, but instead throws a temper tantrum. You guys probably don't know the person on the first example here, but John McEnroe was a famous tennis player back in the 70s, 80s, old enough ago that they had wooden tennis rackets. And he was famous for his temper tantrums when somebody made a call that he didn't agree with about calling a ball out or in. And he would stop the game and throw a big old fit, and he would throw his racket on the ground and yell, and he was famous for his tantrums. So he was regressing to a younger age. This might show up in a younger child who has finished potty training or is no longer sucking their thumb, but when the parents bring home a new baby, they regress to a younger age and they start wetting the bed again, they start sucking their thumb again, but you regress, you start acting like a younger age. Another common example I've seen show up on the AP test are college kids who don't accept the reality of having to go to class and doing all their work, and they stay in bed all day, they play video games, they regress to an earlier childlike behavior. Intellectualization is our next one. We think about events in a cold, clinical way to avoid thinking about the stressful, emotional side of it and only focus on an intellectual component. So, for example, maybe somebody's been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and instead of focusing on the loss that they're getting ready to face, they just try to learn everything about the disease in order to avoid the distress and remain distant from the reality. Or perhaps somebody loses a loved one in a car wreck, and instead of coping with that loss, they become obsessed with the details of the car wreck. So they are intellectualizing the situation rather than facing their own emotional feelings. So those again were all defense mechanisms, unconscious ways that we distort reality in order to help our mind cope or help our ego cope with things that we can't accept. The next part of this section are the Neo-Freudians. So we're still talking about psychoanalytic theories, but these are people who came after Freud and who were influenced by Freud. So they do all recognize some sort of unconscious thoughts, but not fully the same as Freud. So our first one is Alfred Adler. Adler recognized that there are unconscious childhood tensions. However, he felt that Freud put too much emphasis on the sexual aspect of that and looked more at what he called inferiority complexes, in which while we're developing, we are trying to strive for growth and superiority. Adler calls his branch individual psychology. So said Freud had gone overboard in centering his theories on sexual conflict, and said he said that we should be focusing on our universal drive to improve ourselves and to master the problems of life. That everybody has this desire to strive for superiority. He believed that initially children feel helpless and weak, and that's why they have difficulties during childhood, especially when they're being compared to more successful siblings. And those feelings can motivate them to develop new talents. But when they can't reach that superiority, they have to compensate. And he calls this an inferiority complex, where they may have feelings of weakness and inadequacy. And sometimes people are trying to overcompensate. When they have inferiority complexes, they work hard to achieve their status and gain power over others. Sometimes they may flaunt their success in order to try to cover up their inferiority. He said compensation, though, is a normal process. Another big part of Adler's theory was the influence of ordinal position or birth order as a major factor in the development of personality. He said that being a firstborn child definitely gives a kid an advantage over middle children and younger children. It's a different environment for the firstborn child, that they can be spoiled, definitely, because they're getting all of their parents' attention. Firstborns can become problem children because they become upset when a second child is born into the family, and then they don't have that full attention anymore. He said second-born children tend to be competitive because they're trying to catch up with their older sibling. He goes into a lot more detail, though, about all of the birth order, middle child syndrome, and so on. Our next Neo-Freudian is Karen Horney. She was considered a neo-psychoanalytic, and she also recognized the power of the unconscious mind. But again, she believed more in the social aspects of childhood growth and development. She said children were trying to overcome a sense of helplessness. And probably what she's most famous for is that she countered Freud's idea that women have penis envy and said women don't have penis envy, men have womb envy. About that. Probably the most famous of the Neo-Freudians is Carl Jung. It looks like Jung, but it's pronounced as Jung. He was a student of Freud's and for a long time good friend of Freud's, but eventually, and by the time Freud passed, he was a nemesis of Freud, or his enemy. He calls his analytical psychology, so not psychoanalytic, but analytical psychology. And he also recognizes the idea of the unconscious mind, which he calls the personal unconscious, where we have our own repressed thoughts and memories. But what's unique about Jung is he recognizes the idea of a collective unconscious, in which he says that all people have shared unconscious thoughts, that we have these universal symbols that show up in art and in history and artifacts of so many different cultures that are very similar because we share these unconscious thoughts, and he calls them archetypes. Jung is also known for being the first to describe the ideas or personality traits of introversion and extroversion, with introversion being more inwardly highly contemplative and reserved, and extroversion being more outgoing, talkative, and friendly. So how do they measure these unconscious processes? We know there's not a true, what we would consider today, reliable and valid method. That's why so much of the unconscious and psychoanalytic perspectives are considered not empirical. But there are two main projective tests that are considered to reveal what's in the unconscious mind. And they're the thematic apperception test and the Rorschach ink blot. We've mentioned the thematic apperception test earlier in our motivation sections. But Henry Murray developed this test in which they would show people pictures and have people tell stories about these ambiguous scenes where, there's a lot of different things, like what is this woman thinking while this other woman is watching her? What's going on in this story here? And what you are saying is happening in the story is you projecting your inner thoughts and feelings onto the test. The Rorschach ink blot, you probably recognize these images. In my own classroom, I have some pictures of these. It was the most widely used projective test by Herman Rorschach. The original test had a set of 10 ink blots, and people were asked to look at the ink blot and identify what they saw. And what they interpreted in the picture was supposed to reveal their inner feelings. So, for example, maybe you see in this middle picture, those are your parents arguing. In this other picture, they're arguing in the car. So that would reveal that you have some kind of inner tension about issues with your parents. So the criticisms with the projective tests is that they really do lack both reliability and validity. They're not consistent. They're not very good at predicting what they're supposed to. Even people who are trained with the tests would come up with different interpretations. So poor reliability, and they may misdiagnose a normal person as being pathological or having a disorder. So that lacks validity. All right, that's it for 7-6.